Well, now, Jeffrey, let's have a brief interview, a brief introduce with the chat, and speak us about your case and how you could get released after 16 years, no?
Yes.
16 years in prison.
Okay, at the age of 16, I was arrested for a murder and rape, which I was innocent of. I was arrested based upon a coerced false confession, which the police got from me after interrogating me for many hours. They used scare tactics. They raised their voice at me. I wasn't given anything to eat. I was attached to a polygraph machine. Didn't have an attorney present. They kept asking me the same questions over and over again, getting more and more ferocious as each hour went by. I was there for many hours. Towards the end of the interview, the polygraphist, he said that you just told me through the test that you committed a crime. We just want you to confirm this. And that really made me really frightened. And then a police officer came in the room who was pretending to be my friend, and he told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he was holding them off, but that he could not do so indefinitely, that you have to help yourself. Listen, if you do it, if you say what they want, then they'll stop what they're doing and you can go home. And being young, naive, and frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long-term implications, but instead being concerned with my own safety in the moment, right then, right there, myself and the police, I took the out which they offered and I made up a story based on information which they gave me in the course of questioning me. By the police officer's own testimony, at the end of the interrogation, I collapsed on the floor and was crying uncontrollably. I was in what they described as a fetal position. So my wrongful conviction was caused by this coerced false confession, the fabrication of other evidence, fraud by the medical examiner, prosecutorial misconduct, and my public defender was not very good. I was convicted even though a DNA test before my trials, 6 months before, showed that semen found in the victim didn't match me. Hair on the body also didn't match. In fact, it was said that the hair belonged to an African-American male. I lost all of my appeals. Ultimately, I was served 16 years in prison before further DNA testing, which was secured on my behalf by the Innocence Project. It not only reaffirmed my innocence, but it also identified the real perpetrator, whose DNA was in the CODIS databank as a result of him killing another woman 3.5 years later after he killed the victim in my case. On September 20th, 2006, my conviction was overturned. I went back to court November 2nd, 2006, at which point all of the charges were dismissed against me on the grounds of actual innocence. I received an acknowledgement of my innocence and an apology from the prosecutor in the room and the judge, but neither of those people were involved in my case originally. So I've been home now for about 5 years. I'm now 37.
Okay, Jeffrey. Now let's speak about the work your foundation is doing. What are the main proposals you are doing, and if you could tell us which laws have already been introduced, which suggestions to be law have been introduced in the local Congress, and which were, if it's possible, the persons who helped you to introduce those laws, although most of them have not already been enacted as law.
My organization, which is called the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, the website is www.thejeffreydeskovic, that's THEJEFFREYDESKOVIC, foundationforjustice.org. We are focused on clearing other wrongfully convicted people not just in DNA cases, but also, more importantly, in non-DNA cases. DNA is only available in 10 or 12% of all serious felony cases, and so there are people who are in prison wrongfully who have no place to turn to help prove their innocence. And so that void is what my organization seeks to fill. We also take DNA cases. There is a legislative component of my organization in which we seek to pass laws to prevent other people from experiencing what I did, being wrongfully convicted. And we also raise public awareness. And down the line, we hope to also have a reintegrative program which will assist people in putting their lives back together again after being incarcerated wrongfully. Some of the legislative reforms that have been suggested in the legislature that both I have personally lobbied officials for and testified to at hearings, as well as many other organizations in the field to prevent wrongful convictions. These policies are as follows. Firstly, false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the United States' 273 DNA-proven wrongful convictions, and efforts to prevent false confessions from causing wrongful convictions include videotaping the entire interrogation from beginning to end, when the camera would focus on both the questioner and the person who's being questioned. Another suggestion to address this would be allowing false confession experts to testify. There are some jurisdictions where that is the case, and there's many others where it's not. The experts do not give an opinion on a particular confession, whether it's true or not, but instead they give the jury contextual information about what factors would cause an innocent person to confess, because the average person thinks that an innocent person would never confess. Particularly vulnerable populations to false confessions include juveniles as well as people with mental problems, although a normal adult can be made to falsely confess as well. Misidentification has been the cause of wrongful convictions in 75% of the 273 DNA-proven wrongful convictions. Reforms in this area include showing photos one after the other instead of simultaneously, recording the process, using the double-blind method so that no inadvertent cues or clues are given by the police officer, taking a confidence statement from the witness. In other words, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you of your identification? Making sure that everybody in the lineup or the photo array resembles the description given by the witness, and so that nobody unduly sticks out. Informing the witness that if they don't make an identification, that the investigation will continue, so that nobody feels pressured to identify somebody unless their assailant gets away. And lastly, informing the witness that the actual perpetrator might not be in that lineup or photo array. In addition, the practice of a show-up is considered to be a reform that's needed as well, eliminating that practice. A show-up is when the police officers bring a suspect in handcuffs to the victim directly, like near the scene of the crime, or even in the police station where there's nobody else there. And the reason why show-ups are not good because they're too suggestive. I mean, the person, it's clear they would think, well, obviously this must be the person, or they would not have put him in handcuffs. Incentivized witnessing has been a cause of wrongful convictions in 15% of the cases. Incentivized witnessing is when a witness receives an incentive, a benefit in exchange for testimony, whether that means giving them money or reducing criminal charges against them, or dropping a case altogether, or giving them less of a sentence. The reason why this is a dangerous practice is because when a person is caught in a desperate situation with no truthful testimony to trade on, they will resort to falsely incriminating people. Some of the reforms in this area include making it mandatory that there be an external piece of evidence that would corroborate the story and not just the person's word, and also making the informants to wear a wire or some kind of transmission device that could then be recorded to ensure that verbal exchanges are actually obtained. Prosecutorial misconduct is another major factor in wrongful convictions, featuring tactics that include, but are not limited to, suborning perjury, not correcting perjured testimony, working hand in glove with experts, tell me what you want to prove and I'll prove it, and also withholding exculpatory material, that is evidence that shows a person is innocent. Right now, the proposals that deal with this, which are not mainstream issues, but that are issues that myself and my organization advocate for, include criminalizing clear-cut intentional misconduct, as well as enabling the prosecutors to be sued personally. Right now they enjoy what's called absolute immunity, which means that anything that a prosecutor does wrong to convict somebody, if it happens after the person has been arrested, then you cannot hold them liable personally. So there's nothing in place right now with the way the law is to restrain them from some rogue prosecutors from breaking the law in order to convict people, which has the impact of wrongfully convicting some. Bad lawyering is another major cause of wrongful conviction. Some of the proposals in this area to curtail wrongful convictions caused by bad lawyering include having one statewide system, which would enable there to be standards put in place, quality control, and oversight, so that if a lawyer turns in an ineffective performance, then they would not be employed by the state longer to continue to do the same. Right now there is no oversight. Built-in handicaps in the system that hamper even the best-intentioned lawyer would include limiting the caseload. In the Bronx, for example, not too far from here, it's not unusual for one attorney to simultaneously represent 120 people at the same time. It's not possible to devote yourself to each case to ensure a just outcome with that kind of caseload. And we need to have an economically even playing field. A prosecutor has an almost unlimited resources, whereas a public defender has very limited resources. They often have to resort to a judge to give discretionary funding for them to hire experts to assist in case preparation. Many judges refuse these requests because they feel pressure to keep the cost of a trial down on the county. We also need to have equal pay for prosecutors and public defenders so that the best legal talent doesn't go into one side or into private practice. Junk science is another major cause of wrongful conviction, which is when something which is not rooted in scientific principles at all, has no data set, is not replicable, is not accurate, is used in the courtroom as evidence, as further evidence of guilt. And another factor is forensic misconduct, which is different from junk science in that involves the intentional fabrication, either of testimony or of reports, or sometimes both, in an effort by expert witnesses. Whereas such experts are supposed to be objective and scientific and conduct their experiments as a search for the ground level truth rather than tailoring it. Another area that is very important is the effort to roll back the death penalty. New York does not have the death penalty, but there are other states where they do have it. And the objection to the death penalty, amongst other issues, is that the death penalty poses a risk to executing somebody who's innocent. If I had been a few years older and and there was a death penalty in New York, I don't have any doubt I would have received it because it was a brutal crime. There was community outrage, and I was convicted of a rape along with a murder, which is an aggravated circumstance. All of my appeals ran out in 2001, and I wasn't cleared until 2006, so I would not have been alive to have been cleared. Other problems with the death penalty is that there's racism built within it. A person who is convicted of murdering somebody who is white is more likely to receive the death penalty than someone who's convicted of murdering a black victim. Politics gets involved. If a local district attorney has political aspirations, they may seek the death penalty as a means of furthering their career. It's a waste of money. In New York, from 1995 to 2004, New York spent $200 million on the death penalty, while at the same time nobody was executed. That money could have better went for crime prevention, law enforcement, and social programs. Many victims I've met in my 5 years of being free, murder victim family members, survivors, say that the death penalty prevents them from healing and moving on with their life, because every time the person has an appeal, it brings a lot of media attention, which forces them to relive the experience all over again. Another proposal to help correct wrongful convictions is a standardized evidence preservation system. Right now in New York and in many other states, there's no law which mandates that authorities must preserve DNA or other evidence, or that they use any particular system. So if you are lucky enough that you've been wrongfully convicted of a crime where there's DNA evidence in it, and those cases only make up 10 to 12% of all serious felony cases, then the first obstacle you have to overcome is whether or not the evidence has been lost or it's been destroyed. If either of those things happen, then you would be stuck in prison without any means of proving your innocence.
That's what happens in Argentina. There's almost no DNA evidence to prove innocence.
Another important reform, which we currently only have in one state, is called an Actual Innocence Commission. It's in North Carolina, and the idea there is that it's a recognition that the court system makes mistakes, that innocent people are sometimes wrongfully convicted, and that the appellate courts do not catch many of the wrongful convictions. So we're saying that people who are wrongfully convicted need an additional forum to put on a case to establish their innocence. And the Actual Innocence Commission is a way in which that can happen. So far, 3 people have been cleared through the Actual Innocence Commission in North Carolina. Although there are some structural problems with the way the device works, it is a good idea on the theory. It just needs to be perfected more. And clearly it's effective, because 3 people who were proven innocent, who already had lost all of their appeals, they would have been stuck in prison.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And now, which of these suggestions have been already introduced in the legislature, in the legislative branch of New York, although they didn't become laws already?
All of these suggestions, except for the Actual Innocence Commission and the criminalizing prosecutorial misconduct, all of the other ones have been introduced in the New York State Legislature at least since 2006, when I was released. There's been many hearings held. There's been many efforts to pass them. The way the New York legislature works, you have to pass the bill not just in the Assembly, but also the Senate. In many instances, we've gotten bills passed in the Assembly, but they don't get passed in the Senate, and so they don't become law. But I've been advocating for all of these things, along with many other organizations in the field.
So you can show us later a copy of the laws?
Yes, there are bill proposals that are still available online, old bills that were introduced unsuccessfully.
And for example, in New York, the police officers should show something more than just the eyewitness testimony in order to get a conviction. For example, I saw cameras all around. They must rely on cameras, or just they can convict somebody with an eyewitness testimony?
right now, the way the law is, they can convict somebody just based on identification, and it can be as little as one witness.
Huh.
I want to point out also that misidentification experts have found not just problems with identification in general, but there's a particular problem when it comes to cross-racial identification. That is, when a person of one color, they have difficulty in identifying somebody in another race.
Too quiet. Well, Jeffrey, just to
And these reforms, by the way, and identification, and all of these reforms I've talked about, these reforms, like the misidentification, incentivized witnessing, false recording interrogations, these are not just ideas out of the air, but they have been established by means of research by experts in the field who have done many experiments. There's many scholarly papers on the subject. Somebody might think to themselves, well, what would cause somebody to misidentify another person? In most instances, it's not that the witness intentionally misidentifies somebody, although that happens sometimes. More often, it's other factors that lead to the mistake. For example, if a place is not lit very well, or if there's only a short amount of time for viewing, if there's a weapon that's used, researchers have found that a weapon will distract someone's eyes. They'll focus on the weapon rather than on the face. Fear and trauma also have been factors. And lastly, when the mind doesn't recall the specific details, like the descriptions, it's not, the mind will seek to fill in the blanks and make logical conclusions, and that becomes into the person's memory, and they're often unable to separate the two. Factors which reinforce the misidentification include statements from law enforcement, from police officers. For example, if somebody identifies a person who the police think is the person who committed the crime, and they didn't say something to them like, that's good, or that's who we thought it was, then this makes the conclusion in their witness's mind more solid.
Yeah, that's true. The work of Elizabeth Loftus and Charter shows this with
Yes.
evidence, but I think that the most important evidence is DNA. DNA has shown that all these flaws, all these investigations were right. That people many times commit mistakes when they recall something.
DNA has opened a window into the criminal justice system, which enables us all to know that wrongful convictions do happen. This is how we have identified what the flaws are that cause wrongful convictions, and that has led to the development of the reforms. But for DNA evidence, it's much harder to identify the causes because it becomes unclear who was actually innocent versus there was some other problem with a case.
So CODIS is fantastic, no?
CODIS is fantastic. That's a data bank that has DNA samples of people who either are currently imprisoned wrongfully or who will be. I'm sorry, either are now or have been previously, and it has their sample in it, and so that's how I'm sitting here because of it. But at the same time, we should not allow DNA or the CODIS database to lull us into a false sense of security in thinking that wrongful convictions could never happen now because we have the technology. Because number one, DNA is only around in 10 or 12% of all serious felony cases. Number two, DNA is only as accurate as the lab that performs the testing, and that of course assumes that all the correct protocols will be followed and that there will not be any contamination. There have been 3 wrongful convictions across the country in the U.S. based on false DNA matches, which were later exposed through more DNA testing.
Jeffrey, according of what you said and your experience in the prison, for example, in prison everywhere you have cameras. I mean, You think?
No, only in one facilities like that. There's not cameras do not exist in most of the prisons. They
No.
exist in the prison tower to prevent an inmate from escaping, but they don't have the cameras all throughout the prison. No.
But for example, in the backyards or in the places where prisoners eat, they do have cameras or not?
There's a camera in the guard tower, and if something happens, then they turn the camera on. But they're not all around the area and turned on automatically.
And for example, at the police stations where
Yes.
you come in, they also have cameras, no?
Yeah, and that's in the front. But when you go to the interrogation room, although there's camera equipment, the law does not make it mandatory that the police use the cameras.
But they have equipment.
Yeah. In many instances, they have the equipment. Yes.
So they don't want to use the equipment.
No, they don't want to use it. Most stations have it. So one objection to it is the places that don't have a high quality camera. They raise the objection that it would be too much money. And another thing is that they say that they use the excuse that suspects will be less willing to talk on camera. But in jurisdictions where they have done taping, they have found it does not hinder the interrogation process. And in fact, it makes for better evidence. It makes for better evidence because it will prevent somebody from making a false accusation against the police to try to falsely claim.
Of course, that's much better for them, I think.
Yes, in my case, they did not report anything, and as a result of that, there were a few details that the police left out in their testimony. They never told the jury that they threatened me or that they made me a false promise.
But for example, they have cameras in all the facilities. Is there a law that obligated them to put those cameras? Yes, I think, no?
No, there's no law that mandates that they have the cameras there. No.
They just put for security reasons.
No, they put it because they turn them on and record when they want to, when they think it's beneficial to them.
Okay. Well, Jeffrey, just to end this fantastic conversation, this little interview, first of all, I want to thank you again for the time you took to be with me, to have a conversation, and to share with me and all the people who wants to listen your message in Argentina of the needs to reform eyewitness testimony and how it is received, this proof, this evidence, how it is managed, and also how it is valued by judges, because in Argentina we don't have juries, just judges. But I want to tell you that I will make every possible effort for you to go to Argentina and have this same conversation, this same chat in Argentina, because I think people will be delighted to hear your news, to hear from somebody who passed all this terrifying experience, but who has fought and prevailed, because now you are a good person who spreads this message everywhere to everybody who wants to hear, and the work you are doing is very good to prevent wrongful conviction, as it is fantastic the work of the Innocence Project. Thank you very much, and well, I really thank you again for the time you took to be with me and the chance I have to meet you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.